Yeah, I write primarily these days. I was in leadership and admin for a long time, 10 years for the South Sudan team, called it middle management for a long time, and then moved to writing right at 2020 when COVID hit. I had finished my second 5-year term as deputy director for South Sudan and decided the load was a bit heavy, and Claire said, maybe you ought to change a little bit. I always enjoyed communicating, and so decided maybe this would be the thing to do. I remember one time, actually, I don't know if Mrs. Kimoff would remember this, but when I was living in Sudan, we had 10 minutes on the satellite phones that we could use to call family. Every week, Samaritans First would give us 10 minutes to call home. And one time, I was sitting under the tree, and I thought, wouldn't it be something if I just called up Mrs. Kimoff from under this tree? And so I did. She probably won't remember this, but she said, who is this? And I said, this is Tohru. Where are you calling from? I'm calling from Sudan. I've got 10 minutes. So, and we chatted. I don't know about what. So writing. You might be fooled into thinking that I'm quite the extrovert. I am not an extrovert. But I like to observe and to see what God is doing. And that's been my role, essentially mobilizing people in prayer, in giving, in going, to document, to see what God is doing in East Africa and beyond, to document that for people who haven't had the opportunity to see that. And then my joy really is to see people engage in missions as a result of just seeing and witnessing what God is doing in different parts of the world. Since COVID also, Claire, our boys were in full-time school, so Claire decided, well, this is my opportunity. She was primarily taking care of the boys for all that time when they're at home. And when they went to full-time school, decided that she was just going to explode with creativity. And so took on Sunday school and started doing a lot of things there. We started doing Sunday school videos every week for the kids because the kids had nothing during COVID in Nairobi. So every week she had this little stuffed animal that we used to do kids videos. 46, I think, all together, weekly. We'd interview pastors and elders and Sunday school teachers and members of the church. And Timmy Tembo, the little elephant, would go through his weekly problems and have church members help him solve that. Fruit of the Spirit, different lessons that we did after that as well. Last year, I think it was, Claire put together a mock tabernacle. There's so many lessons that you can learn from actually having to build a tabernacle. Fence and all. And also the idea of having to put it away and set it up again every week because you can't just leave it outside. And the idea of moving with it or having to set it up every time. Lots of lessons that the children are learning tactilely, which is very interesting to me. So Claire wants to go back to school, God willing, online. We have that luxury of doing that. So when we get back to Nairobi, hopefully starting further studies and just learning how to disciple, working with children. That's our hope for her. And we're only home a short time whenever we come home, but I'm certainly thankful for the connections that we have had, either in correspondence, letters, Christmas letters, Easter letters, all kinds of letters that you've sent. We're very thankful for that. And it must have been actually a couple of months now that our common friend Ruth Lewis spoke here, yeah? And she had you write letters to the persecuted church. And you sent them to me to distribute to persecuted believers. And I thank you for sending them to me. In fact, before hopping on the plane to come here, I was able to repackage the letters and send them off to different partners and friends to be able to distribute to the persecuted church. And in fact, some who are in tougher situations because of the guidelines that you've used, we'll be able to send them into tougher places than a previous batch that I'd managed to send. last year in what would have been your fall when your leaves were changing colors, I was leading worship at a week-long conference for a ministry within SIM that trains people on how to reach out to Muslims. And this was in the fall. And I was leading worship there, and one of the activities that we did was write letters to other persecuted believers. There was about 70 of us, mostly East Africans, so people from Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, different places in the east of Africa. And we had written about 70 letters to other fellow people who were being persecuted. The workshop, actually, the title, I don't quite remember what it was, but it was sort of something like a Christian response to Islamic terrorism, something like that. And a lot of the participants themselves had endured a lot of persecution and hardship. Africa, actually, is becoming quickly the battleground for Islamic terrorism. The west part of Africa, West Africa, has been in the news a number of times for terrorist activities. And our own Kenya, where we live, is also not immune to that. In 2012, churches in Garissa, northeast from Nairobi, were targeted and 14 people were killed in the sanctuary. In 2013, more than 60 people had died when terrorists stormed the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, in the capital. And the following year, another 60-plus people died in Mpeketoni, which is on the coast of Kenya. The year after that, 2015, more than 140 students killed in Garissa University. In 2019, 22 people died in the Dusit Hostel siege in Nairobi. I remember having to lead worship that Sunday and having to change the entire set to accommodate sort of lament, mourning. One pastor attending that week-long workshop on the persecuted church was a pastor of the church in Garissa where the attack took place. And I asked him about that, and he recounted how he had to bury one of his relatives following the attack, victim of the attack. Others at the workshop recounted how they had suffered also persecution, harassment, how their children were pushed into barbed wire because they're Christian kids, and how their lives have also been threatened. And we wrote letters to other persecuted believers. I wrote about that experience and shared it in a newsletter, and Ruth Lewis, being on our mailing list, received that newsletter and pitched that idea to a church in Calgary initially. And so a few weeks after that, I received a white envelope with a whole stack of letters to the persecuted church. Quickly repackaged those and sent those off with partners to refugee camps in South Sudan and in sensitive areas in East Africa that I won't mention. She came here and did the same, and then I received a few weeks after that also that white package, but an additional 71 letters to be distributed. And as I said, they will go to places where Christ is least known. You wrote letters. That's what you did. You stared at a blank page, and you took a moment to think about what it was that someone halfway around the world would need to hear. And you wrote. You thought about the most important words that you could possibly write, short, in that little A5-sized card. And whether you knew it or not, the Holy Spirit was helping you settle on the words that you were going to write. And I thought about that as I thought about this passage, the aspect that we don't often think about, that this passage this morning from 1 Timothy comes from a letter. Paul knows the challenges that are coming. People will walk away from their faith. That's what's going to happen. There'll be all kinds of funny things that will lead them this way and that. All sorts of opinions, all sorts of quotes and things that sound plausible because they were written somewhere and someone read them. And to be honest, I don't really need to spend that much time emphasizing or convincing you of that, because you are very well aware of all the things that are out there that can sway people left and right. Now, I also, preparing this sermon, stared at a blank page, wondering what I wanted, what I needed, what ought to be said. And I wanted to focus on what I think Paul saw and what he really wanted to convey to Timothy. He's talking to Timothy. He wants to guide Timothy. And Paul's an old man now. In the past, he would sign off his letters, "I write this with my own hand. See what large letters I use." He probably had very bad handwriting. "See what large letters I use." It couldn't have been anyone else but me. But he's probably rubbing his hands on cold mornings now. He's older. And he's happy for other people to write as he dictates. And he's become probably also, Paul, comfortable speaking his mind a little more freely. Paul was once a young man, but he's old now. He puts his glasses on his head and he can't remember where he put them. And he's not going to be around forever. He knows that. But thank God for Timothys who are coming up. The younger ones with promise, who have energy to hoist their sails. Yeah. Do you remember those days? You were young and full of promise, still figuring things out. You were young and you were leading the Sunday school. And maybe some of the kids weren't that much older than you were. Or you were up here leading worship on a 12-string guitar. Or you were singing with the worship team and you still had your braces on. Remember those days? Those days where you clung to that verse, "Don't let them look down on me," or "Don't look down on me because of my age." Don't let them look down on you because of your age, but be an example to the believers. You remember that time when that verse was your go-to? Back then you had more energy. You took chances in prayer. You had guts there. You stood at Christian book tables at university and made a defense of the faith. You handed out pamphlets and tracts. You did prayer walks around the city and the neighborhood. You sang worship songs on the city bus on the way home from a worship evening at the Citadel downtown. You were at the Jesus marches. Remember those? You were there. Do you remember the things we prioritized when we were younger? You wanted to get people excited about God. You wanted people to take their faith seriously. You wanted people to know Jesus. That's what you wanted when you were young. That's what we all want still. But more so, felt more keenly that when in our youth. Now, I was a Timothy once, student leader in InterVarsity, thrust in ministry and still figuring it out. As a young leader, I led Bible studies and worship, preached. But I was so young, yeah. Still only scratching the surface of this deep, deep faith. And I was reading the Word but also made my fair share of mistakes, even here at Bethel. I had basic knowledge, yes. And I had enough of basic knowledge to be doing, I believe, I hope, net good. Enough of a theological gut to keep me on what I think were the tracks. But also young enough to think that having heart sort of made up for all the lacks, yeah. I had passion. Surely that counted for something. And Timothy was probably a youth leader too, InterVarsity, that was around, showed promise, passionate about faith, doing net good, but could use a little shoring up in different areas. And Paul's counseling Timothy, because there was a time when Paul was Timothy, and he remembers what he was like. And he probably shuddered at some of his earlier sermons. Those sermons that he preached when he was younger. At that time, his passions carried through. He thought he could do no wrong. Young. 'Tis great. But sometimes looking back at old manuscripts is a bit embarrassing. I certainly feel that. It's not unlike any of us, really. We preach a passage and wonder, was there ever really any good in there? Do I even know what I was talking about? You preach it and you think, surely that was a mistake. And Paul's made mistakes. It's part of learning and exercising our faith, trying it out, growing in our faith. And he earlier calls himself the worst of sinners, Paul does, because he's made some huge mistakes. He held people's coats as they went to pick up stones when he should have said something. But maybe he also felt like the worst of sinners even after he came to faith, after the road to Damascus. It's just the way you feel when you grow older. Continue to learn what God's grace is like and what it means. You don't think of how much closer you are to Jesus now that you're older. You understand how much more in need you are of his grace. And growing older, I feel how improbable it was for God to have even saved me. Not how much closer I am with my age. And surely I must also still be the worst of sinners, saved only by grace, like you. Amazing grace. How can it be that my God should die for me? Paul may have done net good, but he probably still shakes his head at some of his earlier sermons. A few years ago, a bit randomly, a friend that I had from those days back in university wrote me a message and said that they still remember the sermon that I preached from Genesis. This is about 20 years ago. And I shuddered, really, I did. But I asked, could you tell me the content of my sermon? Which they did. And they added that it meant a lot to them at the time. Net good, maybe, but just barely. With the quality of my preaching, I still feel like the worst of sinners. I wonder about the songs I picked when I was a kid leading worship, even here, right here with Pablo on the drums, if you remember that. I tried my best with the song selections. I had passion, but there are other areas that I surely could have grown in that could have been shored up, strengthened, had a little more maturity. Paul's an old man, and he recognizes the many mistakes that he made when he was Timothy's age. Paul has passion in his youth, but probably wishes he had more theology when he was younger. How could he have gotten it so wrong when he was blind, thinking about it? How could I have gotten it so wrong when you have no eyesight, blinded on the road to Damascus? He could have properly interpreted the scriptures if he had more insight in that. It would have saved him from a great many mistakes. And how he sees Timothy. And it probably reminds him of himself. Because it would remind you of yourself, seeing a young one. Young, full of passion, full of promise. And maybe Timothy, also relied on his natural abilities. A natural student leader at university. He was always quick to answer the questions at Bible study, in dorm, in campus. Maybe he had a lot of charisma. He could get things done, get people motivated. But Paul wants to shore up what is missing, what is lacking. Natural ability won't be enough. When he's out of school and out there pastoring in the real world, Timothy, and people ask tough questions about addiction and suicide. When people ask questions about their children's mental health, how to manage that. When no amount of Bible verses seem to scoop people out from depression. When other worldviews waft along and seem to give answers to deep questions that the Bible doesn't seem to answer. When there are, as Paul puts it, myths and old wives' tales that come and confuse matters further. There are a lot of enticing thoughts circulating out there, and you are not the only one preaching. There are a lot of others who are offering, promising good news. Everyone has an opinion and ideas about how the world works, and with a front-facing camera, you are a teacher. Everyone is a teacher. And my Bible studies in university only prepared me so much for questions out there in the wild, in the real world. Questions about a sovereign God in the midst of war. The sermons I preached during university wouldn't have worked when I visited the refugee camp in northern Kenya, where South Sudanese gathered after the start of the civil war. The sermons in university that I preached wouldn't work at a funeral of a southern Ethiopian missionary that we buried. Or the sermons that I preached when I was young would not work when a church member's 7-month-old son passes away and you are asked to preach. I had to keep learning. In Paul's words, I had to keep training. Paul looks at the empty sheet of paper and thinks of what Timothy needs to hear. And what he writes is, train yourself in godliness. Keep working at it. Keep learning, keep growing. Keep the scriptures close. Repeat. Keep working at it. Keep learning, keep growing. Repeat. When I was Timothy, I had passion, but there were Pauls that came along to help me train in these things. I needed those people. Bruce Lewis Hank Potts with the men's morning Bible study. When I was a young 20-something and invited to be on the missions committee at Westview Bible Church, no clue what I was doing. Donna Legee was there, Glenn Pollock, Reynolds, Bryant's, Kimoffs. The countless people who have preached from this very pulpit. Training, and more training for me. And when I got to the field, older missionaries, church members, all in their own way. And it was training, and more training for me. I don't think I'll ever grow out of being a Timothy. Growing older has taught me that. But I'm finding myself more and more in Paul's space now. We're not planning on leaving the field anytime soon, but I know that I won't be here forever. Between us, this year, Claire and I can count 50 years since we both left Canada to a life overseas. In the fall, when your leaves change colors again, it will be 21 years for me since I left Canada. And Clara first went to the refugee camps in Ethiopia 29 years ago as a young girl. And we went to the field as young Timothys. And after a lot of stumbling and learning and growing, we now find ourselves on the other side of middle age. And I can't help but to adopt Paul's eyes for things. I see the younger folks coming up. Usually the ones sitting up top. And all the old preachers here see it too. Because the old preachers here also know that they're not going to be here forever. We see lots of natural gifting in the young in ministry. But we want desperately, as the older folks, to shore up what is still missing, what is still lacking. Not because we're picking on you, but because we remember what it was like to be your age. All the good that we had and all the direction that we still wanted and needed. So the Pauls are up here, wanting desperately to say, as Paul says, keep training in godliness. Keep nourished on the good food. Salvation is free, yes. But growing in godliness will come as you keep working on it your whole life. And when I was young, I wanted to see people passionate about Jesus, to sing with their whole hearts in worship. Now I still want that. But the Paul side of me also wants to see people go deeper with the word, to train diligently so they don't get tossed around by old wives' tales, by every wind that blows from here and there, so that they can stand secure. I want them to keep growing. I want them to keep training. In 2013, when the Civil War started in South Sudan, we were in Nairobi, actually, at the time. Our firstborn was being born. We missed much of the fighting. Our house was destroyed, I suppose. It's not the right word. Pillaged. And we had a bit of time where we were doing trauma healing in Nairobi for Sudanese and South Sudanese. And after a bit of time there, we came home early in 2014. And I decided to do a second year of seminary in Calgary. And after finishing I committed to teaching everything that I had learned in seminary up to that time about preaching and reading the Word with our Kenyan staff in Nairobi. The staff in Nairobi would have considered themselves Christian, but wouldn't really have considered exegeting the Bible as their role in the church. Is a role that they sometimes feel is reserved only for the pastor. He, she, they are the ones to exegete the passage. At that time, I preached a devotion at the office every week. And they joined me in those weekly studies that we'd organized. And we went through the passage with every single tool that I knew. We looked at the passage, we did structural analysis of the passage, contextual analysis, literary analysis, genre analysis, social and historical analysis, theological analysis, Christological, and personal analysis. What does this word mean for me? Then I'd have them write a summary statement of what they thought the passage was about, followed by a full sermon outline. Then we'd go through the craft of delivering a sermon, and finally I'd have them manuscript the entire sermon. And if I were a young Timothy, I probably would have said, "You're killing me. This is not even for marks." And at the beginning, they said similar things. It's a lot, they'd say. But they put in the hard work of training. And it's been 9 years and counting. And in that time, they've studied selection of Psalms and Jeremiah, Ecclesiastes, Job, passages from the Gospel, from Kings, various epistles, and even at their request, the book of Revelation. They'd also presented those sermons, some of them only having high school education, to our seminary-trained missionary team. In fact, what's gratifying to me is when we finish reading a new passage together, and there's a long silence, and I can hear the thin pages of the Bible being flipped back and forth. And after a little more silence, I would ask, what are your initial thoughts on the passage? And one of them would answer, I was just reading back a few chapters to get the context. They've got it. They know how to read it now. They're not just reading the verse, they're reading the whole thing, trying to understand. They've been training. And when their peers and family and even perfect strangers have asked questions about how the world works, they have been able to guide them by opening the good book. And it actually took me writing this sermon to realize that they are also Paul's now. Paul's old now. He's aware of his age in this letter. And I hear it differently because I can hear him between the pages kind of saying, "Hey folks, I'm not going to be here forever." And I'm the Paul now, who won't be here forever. And if you pardon my saying this, some of you also look like you're not going to be here forever. Time and ministry and plenty of mistakes, even regrets, have informed what we, as Pauls at our age, feel is important. Bethel, you have been there, that community. You've been that community for me. Many of you would say of me, perhaps, as Paul would, that I was your spiritual son. And I would hope that some of you would say that I've turned out to be a good Timothy. I've made all my mistakes with you. Westview, Faith, Bethel. I've made all my mistakes with you. But I've also grown through you. I've been trained by you. Your Browns, Michael and Patricia, Gene Phillips, Brereton's, Bryant's, Schmidt's, Reynolds, Kimov's. I can't list them all. The old Pauls. Those who have traditionally, occupied the seats closer to the front. And some whose places have been vacant for a while. We won't be here forever. I don't plan on going anytime soon, but still, I'm the Paul now. And I see the young ones as you see them. Some of their song choices seem strange to you. Some of their sermons could use some work. But their hearts are in the right place. Timothy, the Timothys out there, we won't look down on you. You're doing good stuff. You're doing good work. Keep it up. You've got spark. And we want the best for you. We want you to be able to handle all the things that come. These weird ideas, foreign ideas, things that waft in and out, come and go. We want you to be able to handle those things. Train yourself. Don't be lazy about that. Don't be swayed by all the things out there. There are a million cures, remedies, techniques for cleansing, for centering, even for salvation, they would claim. But they are just passing myths. Train hard in godliness. Keep working on yourself. And you'll keep taking God's people forward when we're gone. And when those tough times come, you'll know what to do. You'll know how to answer hard questions. And though we may live in a time where people turn away from the faith, with you, young Timothys, we will be in good hands. Paul or Timothy, whichever side you're on, my hope is that we sharpen and allow ourselves to be sharpened. Because, as Paul says, we have put our hope in the living God, who is the Savior of all people, and especially those who believe. Amen.